Good evening, St. Luke's. We are getting ready to start our Wednesday night Bible study. So if you're joining along, I encourage you to go ahead and grab a Bible and open it to the book of Job. We are working on, I think, the fourth week of this. We've slowly been working our way through the book of Job from the very beginning. We're going to work our way to the end. This week we're covering chapters 21 through 31. If you haven't had a chance to read them, that's fine. We're going to move over them pretty quickly just to explain kind of what's going on, but I encourage you to read it. Most of this is written in a fairly poetic style, and so as you read it, you get to hear a little bit of poetry as Job responds to his friends and his friends respond to him. If you're just jumping in, this is the first time you've joined us, then basically what you need to know is the book of Job is about a man who lost everything. God and the devil basically made a bet, and the bet was that if Job didn't have anything, would he remain faithful? Would he stay loyal to God, or would he run away? So what we have seen so far is Job lost everything. Job had his family, his wealth, his health, everything removed from him, and he's sitting on an ash heap. He's hurting. He is in pain. His friends show up to comfort him, to give him a little bit of hope, and they end up not bringing him hope or any sense of well-being. They end up making the situation worse. And so last week and the week before that, we really were moving through what Job's friends were saying to him, how Job's friends were responding, and they really lay it at his feet. They end up tackling this question that we call a question of theodicy, and it's the question of good and evil. How do good and evil work in the world? If God is all good, if God created everything, how does evil exist? Does God will bad things to happen? Does God cause bad things to happen? The reason this question is so important is because we see Job's friends really try to tackle this. Job was faithful. He was upstanding. Job lived a very good life, a life in which he honored God, a life in which he did everything he could, and yet his friends very much begin to assume that he didn't. They take on a mentality that good things only happen to good people and bad things only happen to bad people. And since bad things were happening to him, then clearly Job did something wrong. Job made God angry. Job sinned. Job made mistakes. One friend even implies that it wasn't so much that Job did anything wrong as much as Job did not give all of his best to God, right? If Job had been more sincere or more earnest or more hopeful, then God would have forgiven him. And so we see the friends really kind of tackle this question in a way that's not the most helpful for us, because while to some degree we recognize you reap what you sow, and that question comes up quite a bit throughout the book of Job, and that statement is even said, we have to acknowledge sometimes that there are bad things that just happen. There are times you're directly the cause of them. Drunk driving is a really easy example. If you drink and drive and get in a wreck, right, you caused the bad things that happen from that. However, if you're driving down the road and a drunk driver hits you, bad things have happened to you, and you did nothing to cause it. You see, the question of theodicy isn't quite as easy as Job's friends make it sound. They make it a very causal kind of thing. You cause it and you deal with the effects. Whereas that's not how life is. If you were with us for our study before this, we spent quite a bit of time talking about creation, and not just talking about creation, but talking about how sin entered into creation. And how in one fateful moment, Adam and Eve bite from an apple, and humanity is forever splintered, right? Humanity has a little bit of evil now built into it. We're made in the image of God. God is still all good. God is still with us. But at the same time, bad things just begin happening. It's called sin. Sin entered into the picture. And because of that, we now live in a world where bad things are not necessarily caused by God. Bad things are not caused by God. Bad things are caused because our world is fallen. So that's where we pick up in chapter 21, because chapter 21 begins with Job responding to one of his friends. And I encourage you to read it, but verse 7, he says, "Why do the wicked live on, reach old age, and grow mighty in power?" It's a long chapter, but that is the central question Job kind of tackles through the entire thing. He's not getting anywhere with his friends. He's really been trying to tell his friends that sometimes bad things just happen. That God doesn't cause them, that they're not caused by something you've done, but that evil is just here and present and a part of the world we live in. Bad things happen. His friends don't seem to be getting it, even to the point where his friends attack him. They say, "How dare you assume to know God's wisdom and say you're better than us?" They don't understand it, so they try to attack him and belittle him even more. But again, that question Job asks, he says, "Why do the wicked live on, reach old age, and grow mighty in power?" If the assumption that the friends are working on is that you reap what you sow, then why is it that people we know are bad, people we know have done terrible things, people we know do not live good and faithful and upstanding lives? And I'm not even asking you to be judgmental. I'm asking you to think of those people that we know are not good people, and yet they continue to thrive. They continue to survive. They continue to go on living. And sure, they might not be living life to the fullest. We can acknowledge that. If you're living a wicked and unjust life, then you're not living a life of faith. And so you don't have the benefit of knowing Jesus, of having that part in your life. But it still is a hard pill to swallow. If we're going to question why do good things happen to bad people, then Job is also turning it on its head. Because if the friends are going to say that bad things only happen to bad people, then the implication that they're saying is that good things only happen to good people. How well does that stack up? Sometimes I've watched it when we see people go through hardships and difficult moments, our human side, that little bit of sin that we have inside of us, the not so nice side of us, it's really easy for us to say, "I wonder what they did." It's really easy for us to say you reap what you sow. When it's other people, it's very easy for us to look at it as black and white. It's easy for us to be like Job's friends. We show grace when it's us on the line, but we don't entirely have the ability to show grace when it's others. However, what I have watched is that when wicked people prevail, we do get a little upset about that. We do get frustrated. It's not fair. It doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem to make any sense. How can we follow all of the rules? How can we live the life God has called us to? How can we have this faith and yet watch others do so much better than us by living a life that isn't right? So Job tackles this question. And it makes you immediately recognize that as we talk about justice, as we talk about how God shows justice, as we talk about how God interacts with the world, you really have to see that justice is there, but not in the sense we tend to think of it as. Job's friends are looking at life in a very materialistic way. They're looking at it in a very circumstantial way. The way they're looking at good and bad has everything to do with what you have, what you carry with you, what your life looks like. And certainly if we're using that as the indicator for good versus bad, like Job's friends do, then we have a very skewed sense of everything. Because if you've read about people who live wealthy lives, not all of them, but in several memoirs of several very wealthy people, they've all acknowledged how lonely, how isolated, how their life looked great on the outside, but yet it wasn't nearly as great as it appeared. You see, Job's friends, the benchmark for faithfulness and faithlessness had everything to do with material well-being and circumstances. When that's not the justice that God is looking at. God's not looking at justice based upon what you have or where you are, but instead looking at justice in terms of how is our spiritual well-being doing? How is our faith doing? And even how is it that we live life with unmerited blessings? How is it that grace seems to be shown even when we don't deserve it? So jumping to verse 20, Job says, "Let their own eyes see their destruction, and let them drink of the wrath of the Almighty." So this is how Job kind of sums up this last little bit, and it's basically, if you think life is fair, the three friends who have spoke to him, if you think life is fair and you get what you get, and as we tell our kids, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit, then the eyes of the wicked need to be opened. Then the wicked people should see their ways and they should turn from it. Everything should be destroyed. But Job kind of does this in a finger-wagging way. He's like, right, like if what you're saying is true, that the wicked people will have their destruction, then destruction's coming, right? They're going to lose everything they have, right? Except that doesn't happen. The wicked people Job is talking about continue living their stuff, having their stuff. Job continues living where he's at for the time being. And you get a very big sense of there's cosmic justice, but it's not based upon this material or physical well-being. It's not based on the circumstances. Again, this shifts us back to that very first question we've tackled of how can you remain faithful even in the midst of the most difficult circumstances. And what Job has argued away in this argument is that remaining faithful is still always a possibility, because remaining faithful has nothing to do with what we have or where we are. Remaining faithful is an internal mentality. It's as simple as saying you're going to remain faithful to God regardless of what the circumstances bring. And in fact, Job argues throughout these intercourses with his friends that if your faith is based upon your circumstances, or if your faith is based upon what you have, then that's not faith at all. Faith is the willingness to stand in the middle of the night, in the darkest, and to continue believing. Faith is what allows Job, and as we'll read in just a moment, the ability to stand in the midst of his friends when everything is going poorly and still say that he wants nothing more than just to have an interaction with God. So we jump into chapter 22. Eliphaz begins speaking again. And in verse 21, he says, "Agree with God and be at peace. In this way, good will come to you." His friends just need to go somewhere, and by this point you can certainly grasp that he will not be calling them friends when this is over with. As Eliphaz continues speaking, all of three friends, when they interact over these next couple of chapters, are tired of arguing with Job. They want Job to submit, they want him to agree, they want him to have their understanding, and that's it. And basically what Eliphaz just said is, look, we all agree, everybody sitting here, you're wicked, you're evil. In verse 21 he says, if you will just agree with that, shut your mouth, quit arguing, just agree that you're not a good person, then everything will be the way it needs to be. You can be at peace. Maybe not at peace with your faith, but you can at least be at peace that you caused it. He says, receive instruction from the mouth and lay upon his words in your heart. If you return to the Almighty, you will be restored. If you remove unrighteousness from your tents. We're back to that very simple understanding of where you're at is directly your fault. That what you're facing in this moment is because everything is fair. Because the world is 100% and completely ordered. And yet we know that that's not how it happens, right? We know that peace doesn't come because you accept your circumstances and move on. Peace comes because we accept that in the middle of our circumstances, in the middle of what we face, God is still there. Not only has this been one of the hardest months in ministry because I have faced unknown circumstances, right? As we look at what does it mean to worship in the midst of a pandemic? How do we worship when we can't be together? How do we do Bible studies when no one else is here? Sabrina's mother also was very sick. And in the midst of all of that, in the midst of visiting with my father-in-law, in the midst of talking to my wife, in the midst of seeing my children as they tried to understand that their mama was going to be gone, right words seemed to fail. I find myself having a hard time reading Job's three friends because it doesn't matter how you cut it. What the three friends are saying is that what happens to you is a product of what you've done. And the hardest part is sometimes we believe that, but over this last week, I've struggled because how do we look at somebody who lost a loved one to cancer and say that they died because of something they did? That's what happens here in Job, right? Your circumstances are because of what you've caused, and you just need to accept it. How do we accept that a 58-year-old woman died of cancer with a 19-year-old son at home, leaving lots of grandchildren that didn't understand? These three friends, their faith is so simple, and yet it falls apart on so many levels. We don't find peace by thinking that we've caused what happens or that people get what they deserve. We find peace by understanding that even in the evil, in the sad, in the sick, that God is still there. That when Eliphaz says, basically, if you ask, you will get, it's a juvenile way of looking at it. Eliphaz means if you ask to have your stuff back, God will give it back. And that certainly is not how it works. If you ask, you will receive. But we know that God answers prayers in ways we can't predict or understand. You see, it's not necessarily that Eliphaz and the three friends are on the wrong trail. They're just at the very beginning of it. They're giving terrible advice because the only thing that matters to them is the circumstance and the possessions. So Job goes on. In chapter 23, he responds again. And in verses 3 and 4, he says, "Oh, that I know where I might find him, that I might come even to his dwelling. I would lay my case before him." Again, right here we have Job jumping back to those two things he requested. The biggest one being that he wants to have interaction with God. He believes God. He knows God is still there, and he just wants to be able to bring his plea before him. Jumping to 10 and 11, he says, "But he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall come out like gold. My foot has held fast to his steps." He's acknowledging in all of this that God does not seem to be near him, that he's having a hard time, that it's difficult, that he's in pain, and yet he still is acknowledging that God is watching his every step. And because God is watching his every step, he is remaining faithful. He's saying, "My feet have held fast. I keep the way I'm supposed to go, and I've not turned aside." We're seeing in Job a huge difference between the three friends, because he's saying that regardless of what's going on, even me getting bad things I don't deserve, I'm going to remain faithful. And it's a faithfulness the friends could never understand, because the friends are so bent on only what they can see, whereas Job knows that God's faithfulness is very different. So jumping into chapter 24, it's a great chapter in light of everything going on right now. And it says, Job complains of violence on the earth. Job is essentially laying out exactly what we talked about with sin. And that's the fact that no matter how you want to cut it, life is not black and white. No matter how you want to cut it, you don't always reap what you sow. When Jesus said the rain falls on the just and the unjust, that might be the most accurate statement we have. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you've done. There will be great days. There will be days where you feel like you are on top of a mountain. And the other reality to it, because life is broken, is that there will be bad days. There will be hard days. There will be days where things don't seem to make any sense. And Job is crying out against all of this. He's crying out about the place he finds himself. He's crying out about brokenness, about sin, about sickness, about evil. He's crying out about all of it because so much of it just happens. And it's not fair, and it's not right, and it doesn't seem to make sense. But it's the life we live. It's the price we pay for one bite of an apple. Job's friends continue arguing with him. And as his friends continue arguing with him, they continue arguing with, how is it possible that you know things that we don't know? 25 and 26, Job answers again in chapter 26, and he basically says God is so big that to be able to fathom everything is impossible. Again, this is huge to understand because the three friends are arguing from this very limited scope, and they're trying to make everything that's happening make sense in light of that, whereas Job is arguing that faith is something that is so much bigger. Faith is not based upon things that you can see and you can extrapolate and you can make sense of. Faith is based upon the very understanding that when it doesn't make sense, God is still there. So Job keeps his integrity. In chapter 27, it says this: Job again took up his discourse and said, as God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty who has made my soul bitter? And as long as my breath is in me, and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood, and my tongue will not utter deceit. Every couple of chapters, you might have noticed this trend. A friend attacks Job, Job responds, and then Job makes a statement very similar to this over and over and over again, because it's acknowledgement that it's hard, right? He says, my soul is bitter. He is in a difficult and a hard place. But he also says that that difficult and that hard place does not change the fact that he will remain faithful. He says, my lips will not speak falsehood, my tongue will not utter deceit. Even in the difficult moment, Job remains faithful. And it goes back to both what he said before, where God works in ways that we can't predict. And if we jump to chapter 28, we see it there as well. Verse 12 in chapter 28 says, but where shall wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Mortals do not know the way of it, and it is not found in the land of the living. Wisdom has been a huge topic all the way through the friends' discourse and the friends' interactions, because the friends claim to have wisdom. The friends claim to have understanding, and that's what they're bringing before Job. And half of Job's arguments have been that you don't have the wisdom you think you have. You have words, you have some kind of understanding, but it's not wisdom. Because wisdom, he argues right here, is not anything we come up with, but it's what God provides for us. Wisdom is more than just knowledge. Wisdom is more than just IQ. Wisdom is more than just the right answers. Wisdom is truly having God's understanding. And sometimes having God's understanding helps situations to make sense. In making Job's situation make sense, I don't think there's any amount of wisdom that would help make that make sense. There's no way to make sense of terrible atrocities. There's no way to make sense of difficult illnesses. There's no way to make sense of losing everything. There's nothing that can be said that makes it right. That's not to say there's not wisdom, but what it is to say is that in that wisdom, we have an understanding that God is still present and still moving and still working inside of the brokenness that we face. Sometimes the best wisdom we receive is simply peace to know we don't have to understand it all. That's why Job says what he does as he goes on and he explains that wisdom is so much bigger and wider and stronger, that wisdom created things we couldn't fathom, that God understands things that only God knows, is because wisdom is something that we cannot fathom on our own. And wisdom is something that in itself isn't going to make sense without it being provided by God. But yet what we do see is Job argues that wisdom is not going to bring pain. Wisdom is not going to bring hurt. Wisdom is not going to bring division. Wisdom is not going to bring judgment. Remember, if God is here to bring hope, if God is here to bring faithfulness, if God is here to bring peace, then that is what wisdom entails. That's what wisdom encompasses, which means as Job's friends lament with him and tell him that he is in this place because of his own doing, that what he has done has caused this pain, that he's lost everything and it's all his fault, that's not wisdom, because it's not that healing, it's it's not that peace, it's not that sense of well-being that God provides. Wisdom doesn't cut down and destroy. Wisdom builds up and brings peace. Chapter 29 and 30 and 31, Job finishes his defense. And it's a long defense, and it's not any different than anything he has said so far to this point. Job's defense hasn't changed. Job's defense is, I didn't do anything to deserve the wrongdoing. Things happen. Bad things happen. Good things happen. I found myself on an ash heap, but that's because things happen. But I'm going to remain faithful. Because that's what brought him to this point. He's in this spot because in everything he was faithful to God. And now he's in this spot continuing to be faithful. You know, over this next week, I would encourage you to read. We're going to be picking up in chapter 32 and going to chapter 38. There's a fourth person that comes along. His name's Elihu. He's actually a good friend. And we're going to read 32 through 37. Elihu responds in a very different way. He is there for Job. He affirms Job. But in chapter 38, which we'll hit up 2 weeks from now, we're going to get to God's response. God appears. But over the next week or so, I would encourage you. It's really easy to demean and to belittle the three friends because we see how terrible their faith mistakes were. But look at your faith life. Look at how you handle good moments and bad moments. And look at how you counsel those close to you. How do you talk to your friends, your loved ones, your acquaintances when things are going well? Do we always hold to the understanding that wisdom comes from God and that sometimes we don't understand it and that we remain faithful? Or do sometimes we get a little judgmental? Sometimes with others, sometimes with ourselves. Job is challenging us and pushing us to a life that's a little bit deeper, that's a little bit stronger, that's a little bit more resilient. Because our life isn't just about the circumstances. It's about trusting God wherever we are. Let us pray. God, we are grateful that your wisdom surpasses our understanding because, God, in so many times and in so many ways, stuff just doesn't always make sense. But we better understand that it doesn't have to. That you are providing us peace and hope and joy, and that you are with us every step of the way. It's in your name we pray. Amen.